Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Welcome everyone back to another lecture in the introduction to the Shafi'i method. Inshallah, in today's class we are going to pick up, as is the pattern, with a little bit of the things I wanted to mention in the previous lecture. I want to go over the Hawashi in this fourth historical period. Again, in just a little bit more detail. I actually have a couple of them with me. I wanted to show you on camera what the Hawashi look like in their modern print edition. Some older ones and some slightly newer ones. And then after that, the bulk of today's lecture will be to talk about the fifth historical period, which will be from the death of As-Saqqaf in 1335, basically until today. Okay, so this will be the last chunk of historical time that we're going to talk about. Now, talking about the last 100 years or so is going to be a little bit of a challenge, because sometimes when you talk about the recent past, not enough time has passed for us to be able to assess it properly. But there are a lot of challenges and a lot of nuances that we need to be, of all of the historic periods, for you as students, this is going to be the most important one. So we're going to look at a little bit about colonization of the Muslim world. We're going to look at codification of Islamic law, which is very, very important for you to understand. We're going to look at the rise of modern schoolings in the Muslim world. And we're going to look at the emergence of fiqh councils, both within countries and international fiqh councils. We're going to look at how some of the publications of Shafi'i books of furu' and usul and history, the modern publications that is, what's happening in that space, which is important. And then we are going to look at digitalization, the digitizing of a lot of this material. We're going to look at fiqh encyclopedias. And finally, we're going to look at translations. So these are the 8 major areas that we're going to discuss in this lecture, inshallah. Again, keeping in mind that it's an ongoing, process. Probably not for another 100 or 200 years will we be able to properly understand the age that we're in now. And then this lecture will conclude the historic part, and then the final lectures will turn to some more mechanical things about the madhab of Imam Shafi'i, inshallah. Alright, so in the previous lecture, I talked about some of the important hawashi that we find in this time period. So I wanted to show you just 2 that I grabbed from the shelf before I started recording. This is the Hashia of Imam al-Jamal, which is a gloss on Zakaria al-Ansari's commentary on Zakaria al-Ansari's summary of Imam al-Nawawi's Minhaj. And so Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah has the Manhaj al-Tullab, and he wrote his own commentary on that, and this is the Hashia on that. So I just wanted to show you this. This is considered like an old print. Let me see if I can find you the date when this was printed. It's not ancient, but it's old. And this is the volume that I grabbed. I don't think it has the date in it. That's not important, but what's important is I just wanted to show you what it would look like. Inside, inside this black, barrier, inside here in the square, this is the work of Imam Zakaria al-Ansari, his Matan and his Sharh. So you will find, like for example here, you will find in brackets, what's in brackets is the original Matan, and then the sentences outside the bracket are the Sharh. And then this, afwan, sorry, I got that messed up. This is the Matan and the Matan and the Sharh of Zakaria al-Ansari, and what's inside here is the Hashia of al-Jamal. So for example, here he says Nahwu Sukr. This is the Matan and then of al-Ansari, and then outside of it is Ansari's commentary. And then this section you will find here is the Hashia of Imam al-Jamal. So this is what a typical Hashia would look like. Then I have, this is Nihayat al-Muhtaj. This is al-Ramli's Hashia, or al-Ramli's commentary rather, on the Minhaj of Imam al-Nawawi. This particular edition also has the Hawashi of Ash-Shabramilsi and Al-Maghribi al-Rashidi, who are two later day. We talked about Shabramilsi. Al-Maghribi al-Rashidi we didn't talk about. But let me show you a more modern, way of printing, which is, here is the minhaj. You see that there is a little line, a line that demarcates it. So above this line, this is Imam al-Ramli's commentary on An-Nawawi's minhaj. And then below this line, these are some of the hawashi that you find of Shabramilsi and al-Maghribi al-Rashidi. So this is a modern way of doing it, rather than having, the metin and the sharh on the outside and the hashia on the inside. They put it on top and the bottom. And a lot of that has to do with the way the books are printed. We'll get into that in a little bit, but just as sort of as a foreshadowing, the old style, which is this style, which if you're a student of the Sharia, you have books that look like this of all sorts of subjects. This was the way the books were printed, inside and outside. This type of technology or type of printing, something happened. I'm not an expert, but it seems like it was lost, or like the way to do that no longer exists. And that's why most modern books now will have this sort of top, middle, and sometimes even on the bottom part. And it's just interesting. Maybe somebody who is more of an expert in the printing, in the Arabic printing press, sort of can tell us. I just grabbed two just random books from right before I started recording. So I wanted to show you some of these hawashi. Now, it's important because there's a very high chance that you're either going to have these actual books in your library, or you're going to have them as a PDF, as a digital library, and you need to know how to read them. You need to know how to look at them. Now, let me just go back to the Jamal one. Like, let's say I was teaching the Zakaria al-Ansari's work. I'm not going to teach the Hashia. This is what I would be teaching in the class. This is a reference. So, me personally, as Tariq, when I teach Ibn Qasim on the Matn of Abi Shuja' in the Furu'a classes of the Shafi'i madhab, I have, in my hands, I have with me Al-Bayjuri's Hashia. Now, what I read from in the class and what I discuss line by line is Ibn Qasim on the Matn of Abi Shuja'. But the commentary that I have is based on what I would find in here, the Hashia of Imam Al-Bayjuri. So the Hawashi are more like a reference. And as I said, they bring together all of the Islamic subjects. That's the goal. Your goal is to be able to think and talk and write like that. Not in an old style, but I meant in being able to employ all of your skills, all of the sciences in one exposition. So the ulum al-ala, things like nahu, sarf and mantiq, balagha, being able to understand that stuff, being able to understand the riwayah of the ahadith, the dirayah of the ahadith, the hujjayah of the Quranic verse, as the dalil in this point, and then driving it home. That's what the hawashi is. The hawashi are almost like class notes, lecture notes of these, like Imam al-Jamal was teaching Zakaria al-Ansari's book and commentary, and somebody wrote down, you can think of it like that, somebody wrote down his comments in his class notes. Just like if you took what I'm saying now as a commentary on the basic historic structure of the history of the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say there. The last thing I wanted to say before from the last class was that there is obviously the continuation of the writing of Usul al-Fiqh during this historical time period, and we are still in 676 to 1004. Okay. from the historical time period. Afwan, we're in 1004 to 1335. We're in the fifth historical time period. Okay, and one of the most important works of usul to come out of this time was Sheikh al-Islam or Sheikh al-Azhar Hassan al-Attar's Hashia on Jam al-Jawama. So, Hassan al-Attar was Sheikh al-Azhar and he died in the year 1250. One of the most famous commentaries on Jam al-Jawama is al-Mahalli's commentary. So, al-Attar has a Hashia on al-Mahalli's commentary on the Matn of Jam al-Jawama of al-Subki, rahimahumullah jami'an. Hassan al-Attar is a very important figure because he was the one who advised Muhammad Ali Basha, the Wali of Egypt and the creator of quote-unquote modern Egypt. He had advised him that as Muhammad Ali was sending groups of students to Europe to study, he advised him that he should take with him young Azhari students. So, he is the one that recommended, for example, Rafi' al-Tahtawi to go. And Rafi' al-Tahtawi was one of the, I think maybe the first or second, maybe it was the second or third trip to go. He went to Paris. And he wrote a book and a chronicle of his time in Paris, and that has been since been translated. And the title of the book is An Imam in Paris. And al-Tahtawi translated the French Constitution. He translated the Napoleonic Code, which are all the seeds of what become important in the formation of codification, which we'll talk about in the next clip shortly. And Hassan al-Tahtawi lived, and it is the school of it's the school of Hassan al-Attar, from which emerged people like Muhammad Abdu later. So Hassan al-Attar is a significant figure that straddles the end of the, let's say, the late modern period, and the next period, pre-colonization, post-colonization, etc. He had a huge impact on students. And me personally, in my experience, anytime I have been stuck on anything related to Jam al-Jawama or Lub al-Usul from Zakaria al-Ansari, I can say almost 100% of the times I have found the answer by looking in Hassan al-Attar's Hashia. So me, myself, as Tariq, I have found great benefit in looking at that Hashia. I have it just as a PDF, it's a reference book, so I look at it when I need to, and it's extremely, extremely useful, and that's one of the most important Shafi'i fiqh usul writings that we have from this time period. And starting in the next clip, inshallah, we'll pick up and talk about the fifth historical stage. Okay, so now we take a leap forward in history, and we talk about the year 1335 to the modern period. Almost the last 100 years. Okay, almost the last 100 years. Now, as I said in the introductory clip, this is a very hard time period to talk about because in many respects it's our time. It's the time that we live in now. Okay, 100 years ago, we didn't live 100 years ago, but a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, a lot of the institutions, publications that we're going to talk about in this clip and the next clip are things that are still around or their direct descendants are still around. And it's like writing a biography of somebody who's still alive. It's very hard to do that because the person hasn't passed. You don't know what's going to happen at the end of their life. And sometimes there needs to be some distance of time to be able to properly assess. So, I've said from the very beginning that these 5 historical stages are a human construct, and I'm not necessarily holding you fast to them. I mean, you need to know the first tanqih and the second tanqih. Those dates are important, but even more, you should take this with a grain of salt because, again, we're not really sure how these things are going to play out. But what I am going to teach you and talk about in this clip and in the next clip are things that you need to know because the things that we're going to talk about right now directly impact how you are studying Islamic law, how you are studying Shafi'i fiqh, and how, inshallah, it will be applied moving forward. The first thing that the last 100 years, or maybe you can even extend it, the last almost 200 years now, that you need to understand is you need to understand the importance of the impact of European colonization in the heartland of the Muslim world. There have always been travelers from Europe and from the East to Muslim centers from the time of the Salaf till our time. When we talked about Imam Shafii, rahimahullah, and we talked about his biography in the first several lectures, one of the things I highlighted was the ease of travel. This is a man who was born in Gaza, raised in Mecca, goes to Medina, Yemen, Baghdad several times, Egypt. I mean, there was a lot of movement for that was antiquity, basically, and a very old time. So if Imam Shafi'i could travel like that, then anybody could have traveled like that. So this idea that in the past people didn't travel and people didn't visit is not true. And I think, for example, the earliest American to visit Egypt, I read about this very recently, actually was an American who visited Egypt before the American Revolution, before 1776. I think it was like in the 1740s. So people were visiting, but it's like a few here, a few there. They're either very wealthy or they're very scholarly. Imam al-Jabarti, who I mentioned in the previous lecture, who chronicled the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt, his father was, well, first of all, the Jabarti family, they come from Somalia. So they were Somalis living in Egypt several generations. His father was a polymath, well versed in the Sharia, but also taught sciences. He's taught engineering, he taught mathematics, and his father had Europeans that used to come to his class. So Al-Jabarti chronicling the Napoleonic invasion doesn't mean that this is the first time that foreign people came to a place like Egypt. Even before that, in the early 1700s, there were French people, other European people coming to the Jabarti's father's class to study. What I mean by colonization is I mean the political and economic control of many centers, Islamic centers. Egypt, parts of the Hijaz, the Malay world, the Dutch going to Indonesia and Malaysia and that area. That's what I'm talking about. Now, one of the several impacts that has is that there's a psychological impact. Like, well, does this mean that Islam is descending and Islam is failing and will collapse? There's that kind of messianic type of thinking occurs. But also there's an imposition of certain ways of learning, of conducting business, legal efforts, etc. Plus there was a huge wave of translations. So one of the things that we actually benefited from the early early colonial experience was the rise of Orientalism. In its good and its bad, but it did produce translations. There's an early translation of the whole Minhaj of An-Nawawi. I mean, it's not necessarily the best translation, but it's there. Many of these early Shafi'i texts were translated by these early Orientalists for the purposes of colonization, for the purposes of controlling and subjugating these people, but they're translations nonetheless. So the whole field of the modern Islamic studies in the West comes from this tradition, and you can't forget that. You have to know that to be able to make sense of why they teach Islam the way they teach in non-Muslim universities. Part of that, as I mentioned, was also the impact of law. Now, Islamic law, from the perspective of those early Europeans, was quote unquote, all over the place. Well, there's too much diversity. There's too many differences of opinions. You have a Hanafi Qadi, a Shafi'i Qadi, a Maliki Qadi, a Hanbali Qadi. Well, it doesn't make sense. There has to be one legal system, one code. And from this experience, this brings us to the second major point I wanted to discuss, which is the rise of codification. At-taqneen. Codification is one of those things that unfortunately many current day fuqaha ulama don't know anything about, which is very, very sad because it's a very, very important thing. The Europeans are saying, look, we need to do business with you, we need to control you, you need to modernize. Obviously a lot of that stuff we would say is negative, but I'm just giving you the historical background. You need to have a singular code. Now, when you want to come and do codification, you have to codify existing law. What's the existing law at that time? Is Islamic law. So there was this movement over the last 100 years to codify Islamic law. One of the common misconceptions is that codification is taking European legal laws and implementing them in the Muslim world. In some cases that's true, but the majority of the cases it's not. It's simply codifying what already existed, which was Islamic law. I want to share with you something personal because this is a subject that I know a little bit about because my PhD work at Princeton was based on the codification of the personal status law, Al-Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya in Egypt. And it's out in a book form. It's called Rewriting Islam, the story of codifying Egypt's personal status law. I'm not trying to self-promote, but this book will discuss in very great detail the issue of codification, if that's something that you're interested in. But basically what they did is they looked at the Sharia and they found a way, in very much the same way as the Majalla and the Ottoman Majalla, found a way to rewrite Islamic law so that it could look like these modern codes, so that they could be used for adjudicating cases easily. Number 3 was the rise of modern schooling. Up until 100 years ago or so, schooling was the kutab. You went and you learned the basics of the Arabic language, and you learned the Quran, hopefully by memory. Then you learned some of the important hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and then halumma jarra, as we say in Arabic, and then so on and so forth. From the time of Imam Shafii, till up until like the time of Imam al-Bayjuri, for example. Now, modern schooling rose to service the modern state. The modern state required civil servants, people that knew and how to function in that new modern way. So these modern schools emerged as parallel schools to the traditional, quote unquote, traditional Islamic schools to teach a new cadre of students these new jobs. Part of the modern schooling was the absence of the core Islamic subjects, plus the rise of foreign or European languages, French, Italian, German, English. Not so much English in the early part, but the European languages. Well, in some where English was obviously the Commonwealth nations, etc. To learn these new languages. Many things have been written by the ulama lamenting the great tragedy of the modern education. And all of these 8 subjects that I'm discussing with you in these clips, these can be an entire course of study. You could write a PhD dissertation on each one of them. I mean, there's just so fascinating, so many facets to it. But modern learning, what ends up happening in the modern learning is they end up studying Islam, but from a different perspective than the traditional perspective, which links back to the early Orientalist idea. So there are people that study Islam in modern settings or Western university settings or school settings, but not from our perspective. And that's a challenge that emerges. I'll pick up the other points in the last clip, inshallah. So, colonization we've talked about, codification we've talked about, modern schooling. Now I want to talk about fiqh councils. Now, maybe the first 3, there's a little bit of like a negative tinge to it, so let's turn to the positive a little bit. Fiqh councils. The last 100 years, really more like the last 50 years, but let's just go with it. The last 100 years, there emerged this idea that ijtihad we can no longer simply rely on individual ijtihad. We need the group ijtihad. And many of the people that talked about taqneen, about the codification, they talked about this. Individual ijtihad will remain until Yawm al-Qiyamah. This is a theological issue for us. That door will never close. There is no door to it. It's just conditions that you have to. Inshallah, some of you will reach that. But because the globalization of the world and the rise of communications and technologies and the rise of things, the world of things has made the world closer, there is a need now to be in conversation. Somebody living in North America needs to know how our brothers and sisters in India are thinking. We need to know our European brothers, our brothers and sisters in Russia and China. All of these things are happening at the same time. So these fiqh council emerged over the last 100 years to try to do that. Some of them do it well, some of them don't do it very well, some of them are in name only, but you'll find the Fiqh Council of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the OIC Fiqh Council. You'll find a fiqh council that's affiliated with Al-Azhar. You'll find a fiqh council in Europe. You'll find a fiqh council in India, so on and so forth. Many, many of these fiqh councils. Now, some of them end up being controlled by different Islamic political, groups and whatnot. But on the whole, these fiqh councils and especially the ones that produce journals or fatwas or writings are very important. You can't be ignorant of those things. Many Muslims, they think I'm the only one that ever thought of this, and that's a mistake. You go look. I mean, sometimes it's hard to research because you can't readily find them. But there's, let's say, 3 to 5 key fiqh councils. The one that's associated with in Jeddah, that's associated with the OIC, or the World. The other organization that's in Al-Qura, I can't remember its name right now. The one associated with Al-Azhar, Majma' al-Buhuth al-Islamiyya, very important. They have proceedings that are published since the 1960s. I've seen them and I've used them. They're not that very long. And these other fiqh councils, you need to know what these senior people today are talking about, how they talk about different issues. Number 5 is publication. In the first clip, I showed you these 2 hashiyas. One is older and one is newer. So what's happening is today there are many publishing houses, Islamic publishing houses, that are coming out with critical editions of these classic books. So specifically, particularly what I'm using a modern print of the hashiyah of Imam al-Bayjuri, which is an excellent, it's an excellent copy. It's so important I made sure that I bought 2. It was hard for me to find the second one, but I wanted to make sure that I never not have access to it, because it's such a great way with great footnotes, takhrij of the hadith, a nice introduction. Many of them are done based on original manuscript forms, so there's some inaccuracies in the old prints that are corrected in the new prints. Very, very important. As a young Sharia student, you also have to learn which are the reliable prints versus which are not the reliable prints. Not everything that glitters and shines as gold. There are some people that put money into the presentation of the book, but then when you open it, you realize it's not very good. So the people who do the editing, who do the tahqiq, they're like, they have like a fan base. You have to know who this person is. If it's a reliable scholar, a known scholar, has dedicated their life to studying, Imam al-Awza'i, and then they come up with a critical edition of al-Awza'i, then that's the book that you get. That's the edition that you get. But then there are other mom and pop publishing houses that are trying to imitate and cash in on that, so they'll have the same book, but when you examine it, you'll realize it's not the same. So it's very important that you learn which are the books that you can rely on and which are the books that you don't rely on. I try my best when I teach to show you the actual book that I have in front of me that I teach from when it's appropriate. Not that I am the one the measuring of all what's good and bad in the publishing world, but at least I'm being transparent. I can show you what I rely on, and I do try my best to get the books that people have recommended. Okay, number 6 is digitization. So, with things like a Shamila, our own QuranicThought.com website, there are many digital platforms that have hundreds of thousands of digital copies of books. So if you ever need to find an Islamic book, you should start by writing in English PDF and then writing the title of the book in Arabic. If within the results of the first 2 pages of search, you should be able to find a free download of that book. And this is an affordable way because it doesn't cost anything. It's just, you'll have a memory problem at some point if you download too many books. But it's very important that you familiarize yourself. No one taught me this, by the way, which is one of the things that I had to struggle with after as I got older, was learning how to use something like a Shamila. Part of it is because I'm an Apple user, and at the time Shamila only worked on Windows, so I just never used it. And now they have a new online version, which alhamdulillah I can use, so I'm getting used to it. Something very recent for me. When I needed to look up something, if I didn't have the physical, if I didn't have like the physical book with me that I'm looking at, that's the only way I could research. So I'm a little old school. Hopefully you guys can be a little bit more nimble and modern, but you need to learn how to use those digital platforms. Let's just use a Shamil as a benchmark because it's what's most accessible. And you need to know how to search by the author's name. You need to know how to search with inside the book. You need to know. You also need to know its limitations. There are Shia databases if you're looking for Shia sources. There are Hadith databases if you're looking for Hadith databases, so on and so forth. So don't think, if it's not in the Shamil, it doesn't exist, because the Shamil is not the only thing. There are many other things. Our platform, the Quranic Thought platform, we're almost at 1 million between manuscripts, million titles between manuscripts and printed books. So we have a lot too, and we try our best to present, the entirety of the Islamic tradition. So in your course of research, there should be no excuse. Oh, I can't afford the book. You don't need to buy the book. You can download what you need, and you can download the volume that you need if it's a larger book, and you just have to read on the screen. It's a little bit difficult. Some of them are more advanced. You can research, like a Shamila, you can search inside the text. If you download an Arabic PDF, you won't be able to search inside the text. That technology doesn't exist yet, but I'm pretty sure in a few years that technology will be there. Number 7, fiqh encyclopedias. The most famous being the Fiqh Encyclopedia of Kuwait. And these type of encyclopedias, to go back to a term that we've introduced earlier, are more comparative. So I remember when I was doing my doctorate, and I have a sub research area in my book about talaq. So I remember I would look up talaq in the Kuwaiti encyclopedia, because when I was writing my thesis, I didn't want to write as a Shafi'i, I want to write as a scholar of the Sharia. So I needed something more universal, and I found a lot of the entries in the Kuwaiti encyclopedia to be fantastic. Very general, also brings you the different madhahib, the different opinion, and that's important. However, if you are doing real comparative work, like if you're writing a fatwa, you can't rely on that. You have to actually go to the Hanafi source and read, Ibn Abidin. You have to go to the Maliki source and read, what Khalil says and his commentators. You want the Hanbali source, you have to go to the Ki Hanbali. You want to go to the Shafi'i, you have to go to the actual Hashia. So the way to use the encyclopedia, it's sort of like a pin on a map. Like when you go to Google Maps and you pin a place, but then you need to drive to that place. So the driving to that place is going to the library, either actual physical books or digital, and actually reading what the original text was, just in case there is translation or misquoting in the encyclopedia, or if there's more, in the hashia around the subject matter that you can add to your subject. But the encyclopedias are very important. And then lastly, number 8 are translations. Of course, this entire program is done in the English language, so translations is something that's of extra concern for us. There are many, many, many translations, and as there are many, many translations, the quality of the translations are many. There are many translations that suck. They're horrible. There are many translations that are excellent. There are many translations that are reliable, but the language is difficult. And as somebody who's bilingual, it's not easy to translate, to be able to take the original and to translate it. Alhamdulillah, we do our best in this program and in the university to make sure that the English translations that we use are reliable, usable, and accurate. And like I mentioned with the books, you have to also make an effort to find the right translations of the original text that you're looking for. These are the 8 core things I wanted to discuss in this lecture. We will end here, and then in the last 2 lectures, we will look at more of the mechanics of the Shafi'i madhab and how you study it, inshaAllah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's class, we were able to first begin by talking about some of the things I wasn't really able to do justice to in the previous lecture, which was to talk about the Hawashi, and I was able to shed, hopefully, inshallah, some more light on that. And then we moved in to talk about the 6th historic period, which we tag from the time of the death of As-Saqaf al-Makki, rahimahullah, from 1335 to our time. And we discussed 8 important factors to consider in understanding our predicament now, in the last couple hundred years. The first is to understand the tremendous impact of colonization. on the heartland of the Muslim world. A derivative of that, and the second issue, is to understand the importance of codification, of legal codification, how Islamic law was codified in the modern world. Number three, we talked about the rise of modern schooling and how that created a alternative way of upward mobility. Number four, we talked about the emergence of fiqh councils, whether they be national fiqh councils or international fiqh councils, and the importance of paying attention to what they say, their proceedings, their fatwas. Even if we disagree, if people disagree with those opinions, nonetheless they're important. Number five, we talked about the modern efforts of publications of critical editions. Some of the books that I showed you in my collection, some of them are older, some of them are newer, but you can see that there is now an effort to do critical editions, to do takhrij of the ahadith in a book, to go back to the original manuscripts of a particular book and come up with a critical edition. Now there are many of these out there, and one of the things that I cautioned you is you have to learn to find the editors that are people that you can rely on, or the publishing houses that you can rely on. Number six, we talked about digitization and the fact that things like Ashamila and other online platforms have digital collections of books, and as a student of the Sharia today, you need to be able to learn how to access that. Number seven, we talk about fiqh encyclopedias. We talked about the Kuwaiti fiqh encyclopedia being the foremost one. It's available online as well, and the importance of looking at that for comparative purposes. And lastly, number eight, and probably most important for us because we're conducting these classes in English, we looked at the importance of translations and how translations have really gone back to the time of the Orientalists till today. There's good translations, there's alright translations, there are horrible translations, but there are translations nonetheless, and you need to be aware of what's been translated into European languages from the books that you're concerned with. These are the main issues and subjects that we discussed in today's class. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.